The morning was cool, and a light mist hung over London as people gathered outside the courthouse. Inside, the sound of footsteps echoed through the marble hall. Reporters waited near the entrance because it was not every day that a royal guard was called to appear in court. Thomas Reed, a tall and quiet man in his 30s, walked down the corridor dressed in his full ceremonial uniform. The deep red coat was buttoned perfectly, the black boots shined like mirrors, and the tall bearskin hat stood high above his head. He walked with the same straight posture he held while guarding Buckingham Palace, calm and silent, even though every eye in the building followed him. Thomas was there as a witness to an incident that had happened a few weeks before. He had stopped a reckless driver who almost crashed through the palace gates. It wasn't his usual duty to testify in court, but he followed orders as he always did. The courtroom, however, was not ready for what it saw when he entered. People whispered as he walked to the witness bench. Some found it strange that he didn't remove his hat. Others smiled or took quiet photos before the bailiff warned them to stop. The judge, an older man named Judge Peterson, adjusted his glasses and frowned at the sight. He was known for being strict about decorum, and to him, a man wearing a giant bearskin hat in his courtroom looked out of place. "Mr. Reed," the judge said, his voice deep and sharp, "this is a court of law, not a parade ground. Would you kindly remove your hat?" The words cut through the quiet room. Thomas didn't move. His chin stayed lifted, eyes forward, hands resting at his sides in perfect stillness. It was the same posture he held on guard duty for hours at a time. The silence stretched for several seconds. A murmur passed through the crowd. The defense attorney smirked, leaning toward his client and whispering something that made them both chuckle. To them, it was almost funny that a soldier thought he could keep wearing that towering piece of fur in court. The judge repeated his words, this time louder. "Mr. Reed, are you ignoring the court? Take off your hat immediately." Thomas slowly turned his head toward the judge. His movements were calm and controlled, not rude or defensive. When he spoke, his voice was low but clear. "Your Honor, with all due respect, I am not ignoring you. I am following my duty as a royal guard." The judge frowned. "Your duty does not apply here, sir. This is my courtroom, and you will follow my rules." Again, the courtroom fell into uneasy silence. People began to shift in their seats. Even the court clerk paused from writing notes. There was something different about the way Thomas stood. An unspoken dignity. A quiet strength that didn't come from defiance but from respect. Thomas took a small breath before he spoke again. "Your Honor," he said softly, "this uniform is not just clothing. It represents service to the crown and to those who served before me. We are trained to never remove the bearskin while in duty uniform, no matter where we stand. Outside the palace, in the rain, in front of the Queen, or even in front of a court. It's not about comfort or fashion. It's about respect." The judge blinked, surprised by the calm explanation. The defense attorney leaned back, his smile fading. The audience listened more carefully now. Thomas continued, his tone still gentle but firm. "This bearskin is a symbol. It is made from the same design worn by soldiers who fought centuries ago. Every time we wear it, we carry their memory. If I remove it while in service, I am breaking the code of honor that binds every guard who came before me." There was something powerful in the way he spoke. Not loud, not dramatic, just deeply sincere. Even those who didn't understand military customs could feel the meaning in his words. Judge Peterson cleared his throat. "I understand tradition, Mr. Reed," he said, "but there must be exceptions. Surely no one will fault you for showing respect to the court." Thomas looked down for a moment as if thinking carefully. Then he raised his head again. "Your Honor, I mean no disrespect, but I cannot remove it without my commanding officer's order. That is the rule given to every guard since the first of our kind stood before the palace gates. The uniform is not mine alone, it belongs to all who served." The judge hesitated. His authority told him to enforce courtroom rules. But something in the soldier's words made him pause. There was no arrogance in Thomas's tone. "Only loyalty. Only duty." The defense lawyer tried to speak, breaking the moment. "Your Honor, this witness is clearly being unreasonable. We can't conduct proper proceedings if he refuses to follow basic etiquette." Before he could finish, the judge raised his hand to silence him. The room grew still again. Thomas stood motionless, the tall bearskin casting a long shadow under the courtroom light. He didn't look proud or angry, only steady. His heart, however, beat faster. He had faced angry tourists, harsh weather, Even threats outside the palace, but standing here, explaining his duty in front of a judge, felt strangely heavier. Still, he remembered the training words from his sergeant. A guard does not serve for applause or comfort. He stands for those who cannot. He kept his head high and eyes forward, ready for whatever came next. The judge leaned back, studying the man before him. He could see that Thomas was not trying to challenge him or embarrass the court. He was simply standing for something that mattered. Minutes passed before the judge finally said, "Mr. Reed, you may remain as you are for now. But this matter will be discussed after testimony." Thomas bowed his head slightly in acknowledgement. "Thank you, Your Honor." As he turned back to the questioning table, the people in the courtroom whispered quietly among themselves. Some called him stubborn. Others called him noble. But everyone watched him with new respect. Even the defense lawyer avoided eye contact now, realizing the man before them wasn't just a guard. He was the embodiment of something old, something pure, something that couldn't be shaken by rules or laughter. The rest of the hearing continued, but the image of the guard standing tall in his red uniform stayed in everyone's mind. Outside, through the courtroom windows, the gray London sky brightened for a moment, and a small beam of sunlight fell on the soldier's bearskin hat. No one noticed except the clerk, who later swore that it looked as if the light had chosen him. Thomas didn't move until the hearing ended. When he finally stepped out into the hallway, people moved aside to let him pass. Some nodded respectfully. He gave no speech, no proud gesture, just the quiet grace of a man who knew who he was and why he stood the way he did. He wasn't there to impress anyone. He was there because duty asked him to be that day. Before any applause or headlines, before anyone called him a hero, Thomas Reed was simply a soldier keeping his promise to serve, to honor, and to never remove the symbol of his brotherhood, no matter where he stood. The next morning, the story of the Royal Guard in court began to spread across London. People talked about the tall soldier who had stood before a judge without removing his bearskin hat. Some admired his courage and discipline, while others thought he had gone too far. But Thomas Reed didn't pay attention to any of that. He had only done what he believed was right. For him, it was not about pride or fame. It was about following the promise he made to his late brother and to every guard who came before him. When Thomas arrived at the courthouse again for the continuation of the case, a small crowd was waiting outside. Some people took photos from a distance, others whispered softly as he walked past. He didn't react. His steps were steady, his gaze forward. The same red coat, the same black boots, and the same tall bearskin hat were in place. He looked like a statue come to life, every inch of him controlled by duty and discipline. Inside the courtroom, Judge Peterson sat quietly as the people settled in. He looked thoughtful, unlike the previous day when he had spoken sharply. Something about the soldier's calmness had stayed in his mind overnight. The judge had gone home and read about the Royal Guards, their history, their code, their sacrifices. He realized how deeply those traditions were rooted in honor. Still, the courtroom had its own rules, and he needed to balance both sides with fairness. When Thomas entered, everyone turned to look. Even the defense lawyer, who had been smirking the day before, now stayed silent. Thomas bowed slightly toward the judge and stood tall at the witness stand. The judge cleared his throat and said, "Mr. Reed, we'll continue from where we left off yesterday. Please describe the incident near the palace gates." Thomas nodded once. His voice was steady as he began to speak. He explained how he had been stationed near the north gate of Buckingham Palace when a black car suddenly swerved toward the entrance, ignoring traffic cones and warnings. He described how he stepped forward, raised his hand, and ordered the driver to stop. When the driver didn't listen, Thomas signaled his partner to block the path. The vehicle stopped just in time, a few feet before the barrier. The driver appeared angry, Thomas said softly. He shouted that he was late for a meeting. I only asked for identification and reminded him that the gate was restricted. As he spoke, everyone in the room listened quietly. His words were simple and factual, but there was something powerful in the way he delivered them. Firm, respectful, and without emotion. It was clear he was not there to defend himself or attack anyone. He was there because duty had placed him there. When he finished his explanation, the defense attorney stood up to begin cross-examination. The man adjusted his tie and said, "Mr. Reed, you take your duty very seriously, don't you?" Thomas replied, "Yes, sir." "Even when it means disobeying someone else's order, like a judge's order?" the lawyer asked with a hint of sarcasm. Thomas didn't show any reaction. I follow the code given by my commanding officer, sir. It is not disobedience, it is discipline. The lawyer walked closer, trying to find a weakness. So you think your code is above the law? Thomas turned his head slightly, his eyes calm but firm. No, sir. I believe in the law. I protect it every day when I stand outside the palace. But I also believe that honor and law walk together. My duty is to serve both. The room grew silent again. Even the lawyer paused, unsure how to respond. It was rare to see a man speak with such balance, strong yet humble. The judge watched carefully, noticing that Thomas spoke like someone who had spent years serving quietly without ever asking for recognition. The lawyer tried another approach. Tell me, Mr. Reed, what makes that hat so important? Why can't you just take it off for a few minutes in court? Thomas took a slow breath. This bearskin, he said, touching the brim gently, is not just part of the uniform. It carries history. Each one of us wears it for those who came before. It reminds us that we are never bigger than our duty. When I wear it, I remember my brother, who once wore the same. He was my best friend. He died serving this country. Since then, I've never removed this hat while in uniform. Not even for comfort, not even in the rain. Because for me, it's like carrying his memory on my head. The courtroom became still. The lawyer opened his mouth to speak, but stopped. The air felt heavy with emotion. The judge's eyes softened. Even the people sitting in the back row leaned forward, touched by the simple honesty of the soldier's words. The lawyer finally said quietly, "No further questions." Judge Peterson nodded and looked at Thomas. "Mr. Reed, please remain for a moment," he said. Thomas stood still. The judge took off his glasses and spoke slowly. "Yesterday I asked you to remove your hat because I believed it showed respect to the court. Today, I understand it means something much deeper. You are right, honor and law walk together. I was too quick to judge what I didn't understand." The courtroom murmured softly. People exchanged glances, feeling something rare, a moment of mutual respect between authority and service. Thomas bowed his head slightly. "Thank you, Your Honor. I meant no disrespect. I know," the judge said kindly, "and I respect your loyalty." He paused for a moment, then continued. "Tell me, how long have you served as a royal guard?" 10 years, sir," Thomas replied. "Since I was 21. That is a long time to stand in silence," the judge said with a faint smile. Thomas nodded. "Yes, sir. But silence can speak when words cannot. When we stand guard, people come and go. Some laugh, some mock, some salute. We do not move because we are not standing for them. We stand for something greater." A faint smile appeared on several faces in the room. It wasn't arrogance, it was humility wrapped in strength. The judge leaned back and sighed softly. I believe everyone in this courtroom could learn something from that. A few people clapped softly before the bailiff reminded them to stay quiet. The judge smiled slightly but didn't stop them completely. The hearing continued for another hour, dealing with formal matters, but the mood had changed completely. The tension that filled the room the day before was gone. There was respect, calm, and even admiration. Every time Thomas spoke, his words carried quiet weight. Every movement he made reminded people that dignity didn't need to shout. It could stand tall and silent. When the session finally ended, the judge stood up from his chair. He looked at Thomas and said, "Mr. Reed, this court thanks you for your service and your reminder of what true duty means." Thomas nodded once. "It is my honor, sir." The people began to rise from their seats as Thomas walked toward the exit. A few whispered his name. Others simply watched in silence. The same man they had once thought stubborn now seemed like a living reminder of honor. As he reached the doorway, sunlight streamed through the glass and touched his red coat. For a moment it looked like the light itself bowed to him. He stepped out quietly, leaving the courtroom behind, unaware that the judge who had once scolded him now looked at his empty seat with deep respect. The judge turned to the people and said softly, "The law teaches justice. But today that soldier reminded me of something else. Humility and duty." The crowd left the courtroom that day changed, and even the judge walked out slower, as if carrying a lesson he would not forget. The third day in court felt different from the first two. The story of the Royal Guard and the judge had spread far beyond London. News outlets picked it up, calling it the Guard who stood for honor. People shared the moment online, writing words of admiration for the quiet soldier who refused to remove his bearskin hat. But Thomas Reed knew nothing about the attention. He didn't read the news, didn't open his phone. For him, nothing had changed. He still rose at dawn, polished his boots, checked every button on his uniform, and walked with the same discipline that guided him every day. Duty came before everything, before praise, before pride, even before comfort. When he arrived at the courthouse again, the crowd outside had grown larger. Some waved politely, some saluted him like he was a hero, and others just stared in curiosity. He gave no reaction. The heavy door of the courthouse opened, and the quiet inside swallowed the noise from the street. Thomas stepped forward, his boots clicking softly against the floor. The same judge, the same lawyers, the same faces awaited him, but something in their eyes had changed. They no longer looked at him as a man in a strange hat. They looked at him with quiet respect. Judge Peterson greeted him with a nod this time instead of a frown. "Good morning, Mr. Reed," he said kindly. "Good morning, Your Honor," Thomas replied, standing straight. The judge glanced around the room and said, "Before we continue, I would like to address the court. We sometimes forget that symbols carry stories. Mr. Reed reminded us that traditions are not obstacles. They are memories we keep alive." His voice carried across the room. People nodded. Even the lawyer who had been impatient earlier looked humbled. The questioning began again, focusing on the details of the palace incident. But soon the conversation returned to Thomas himself. The defense lawyer stood up, this time speaking more gently. "Mr. Reed," he said, "I think everyone in this room now understands your respect for duty. May I ask what inspired you to join the Royal Guards in the first place?" Thomas looked thoughtful for a moment. His hands remained still at his sides, his posture perfect. Then he said softly, "My father was a guard before me and my brother after him. When my brother passed away in service, I joined to carry his place. It wasn't only a job for us, it was a way of life. My father used to say, 'When you wear this uniform, you don't speak for yourself. You speak for those who never came back.' I've carried that with me every day." The courtroom was silent again. The sound of pens scratching paper stopped. Everyone listened. The judge rested his hands, looking at the man before him with deep respect. The lawyer nodded slowly. "Your father must have been proud." Thomas's gaze lowered slightly. "He was. He told me once that the hardest part of being a guard is not the cold, not the long hours, not even standing still. It's standing tall when people don't understand why you do it. That's when you must remember who you are serving." The judge's eyes glistened slightly. He didn't say anything for a few seconds. The words had struck something in him. "That is a fine lesson," he said softly. Thomas gave a small nod and stood silent again, as he always did after speaking. The rest of the testimony moved forward quickly. The case wasn't about him. It was about the reckless driver who had nearly caused an accident near the palace. But even as lawyers discussed evidence and documents, everyone's attention stayed with the guard. There was something magnetic about the quiet dignity in his presence. He didn't demand attention, but he earned it naturally, through the calm strength that came from loyalty. When the testimony ended, Judge Peterson called for a short break. As the court recessed, a few journalists whispered near the door, hoping to get a word from Thomas. One brave reporter approached him and asked softly, "Sir, how do you feel about all the attention you're getting? People are calling you a hero." Thomas turned his head slightly. "I'm not a hero," he said in his simple, calm tone. "I'm a guard. I just did what any of us would do." "But everyone's inspired by you," the reporter insisted. "Do you have any message for them?" He thought for a moment before answering. "Honor isn't something you show, it's something you live even when no one is watching. That's all." The reporter wrote down his words, but Thomas was already walking away toward the window. He looked out quietly at the street below, watching people move about their lives. He didn't smile, but his eyes softened. Somewhere deep inside, he thought of his brother, and hoped that wherever he was, he'd be proud. When the session resumed, the judge called Thomas back to the stand for one last question. "Mr. Reed," the judge said, "if I were to tell you now once again to remove your hat, what would you do?" The courtroom grew completely silent. Everyone leaned forward. The air was thick with anticipation. Thomas didn't hesitate. "I would respectfully decline, Your Honor," he said calmly. "I mean no offense. But my promise stands. The judge nodded slowly, a faint smile forming on his face. "That is what I expected you to say." He set his pen down and looked at the entire courtroom. "Let this moment remind us all, discipline and respect are not opposites. This man's refusal is not rebellion. It is loyalty, and loyalty is the foundation of duty." The audience remained silent, moved by the judge's words. A few moments later, the judge looked directly at Thomas again and said, "Mr. Reed, your uniform represents more than just service. It represents sacrifice. On behalf of this court, and I believe everyone here, we thank you." Thomas nodded. "Thank you, sir." The judge turned to the audience. "This session will continue tomorrow, but before we close for today, I ask everyone here to remember what it means to serve with honor." He stood up, which was rare for a judge during a hearing. It was his quiet way of showing respect. One by one, people began to rise as well. No one had told them to. It just happened naturally, as if the air itself had asked them to stand. The entire courtroom stood silently as the royal guard bowed his head. Thomas didn't speak or gesture. He just stood tall as he always did, the tall bearskin hat shadowing his calm eyes. The moment stretched for a few seconds, filled with quiet dignity. Then the judge gently tapped his gavel. Court adjourned. As Thomas walked toward the exit, a young intern working in the courthouse rushed forward and whispered, "Sir, that was incredible." Thomas looked at him and said softly, "Do what's right, even when no one claps. That's the real reward." Then he walked out through the large wooden doors, the sound of his boots echoing down the hall. Outside, the evening light glowed golden against the old courthouse walls. People waited by the steps, some cheering, some clapping quietly. Thomas didn't wave. He only nodded once, then kept walking toward the street, where a taxi waited to take him back to his quarters. Inside the car, he looked out at the London skyline, the same streets he had guarded for years, the same city his family had served. The noise of the city faded behind the glass. For the first time in days, Thomas allowed himself a small breath of relief. He had done his duty, and that was enough. He didn't know what the judge was thinking at that moment, but Judge Peterson sat alone in his office, staring at the empty courtroom. He realized that he had just met a man who reminded him of something he had long forgotten, that true respect cannot be demanded. It must be earned through honor and humility. As the clock ticked quietly, the judge smiled to himself and whispered, "That man taught me more than any book of law ever could." The next day began with a soft drizzle over London. The air smelled of wet stone and calm rain. Inside the courthouse, people gathered once again to witness something that had now become more than a simple case. They weren't just there for a hearing anymore. They were there for the royal guard who had reminded everyone of dignity and duty. The courtroom filled earlier than usual. Reporters sat quietly this time, not shouting questions or flashing cameras. There was a sense of respect in the air that hadn't been there before. When Thomas Reed entered, the room fell silent. His uniform looked as spotless as always, the tall bearskin hat standing proudly on his head. He walked with quiet strength, his boots making soft, steady sounds against the floor. Some of the people who had come every day nodded as he passed by. He didn't respond, but a small light flickered in his eyes, a quiet acknowledgement of the warmth around him. Judge Peterson watched him carefully. The man who had once scolded him now looked almost proud. The judge had spent much of the night thinking about what had happened these past days. He realized that Thomas had not just followed rules, he had lived them with heart. The judge had served law his whole life, but this soldier served honor, and somehow both paths met here in this courtroom. When the session began, the judge's voice was softer than usual. "Mr. Reed," he said, "before we continue, I wish to thank you again for your patience and your service. I have received letters from citizens across the country who were moved by your story." Thomas shifted slightly, still standing tall. "Thank you, Your Honor, but I have only done my duty," he said simply. "That's exactly what makes it meaningful," the judge replied with a smile. The defense lawyer rose and said, "Your Honor, with your permission, I'd like to ask the witness a few final questions." The judge nodded. "Proceed." The lawyer stepped closer, his tone now filled with genuine respect. "Mr. Reed, over the past few days, people have seen you as a symbol of duty. But I want to know, how does it feel to carry that weight? To stand still every day? To be silent when others speak? To guard something that most people only walk past?" Thomas took a deep breath. "It's not a burden," he said softly. It's a promise. When we stand at our posts, we're not guarding a building. We're guarding history. Every person who walks by us sees something strong, something unshaken. And maybe, for a moment, they feel proud of their country. That's worth every second of silence. The courtroom was still. Even the sound of rain tapping against the window seemed to fade. The lawyer nodded, understanding that no further words were needed. He returned to his seat quietly. The judge leaned forward. "Mr. Reed, may I ask you something personal?" Thomas nodded. "Yes, Your Honor." "You mentioned your brother," the judge said softly. "You said you wear the hat to honor him. Would you tell us about him?" Thomas's eyes softened. It was rare for him to speak about his brother, but he didn't refuse. "His name was Daniel," he said quietly. "He joined the guards before me. He taught me everything, how to march, how to stand, how to keep calm when the world feels loud. When he passed, I felt lost. For a while, I didn't know how to go on. But then I remembered something he said the night before his last duty. He said, 'Promise me you'll stand tall no matter what. Don't let anyone make you forget who you are.' That's why I wear this hat." It reminds me of that promise. The judge sat silently, his expression heavy with emotion. The audience listened in complete stillness. Even the defense lawyer lowered his eyes, moved by the story. Thomas continued softly. "Sometimes people laugh at us when we stand at our posts. They think we don't feel anything. But we do, we just don't show it. My brother used to say that silence is a soldier's strength. It teaches patience, courage, and humility." The judge nodded slowly. "Your brother must have been an extraordinary man." "He was," Thomas said. "And I hope he'd be proud of me." For a few moments, no one spoke. The judge finally cleared his throat. "Mr. Reed," he said gently, "I believe he would be very proud." He paused, then turned toward the courtroom. "Ladies and gentlemen, we've spent days discussing laws and regulations, but this case has become something more. It has reminded us that behind every rule and every symbol, there are people who carry meaning, love, and sacrifice." The audience nodded. A few eyes glistened with quiet tears. The room felt heavy, but in a good way, a weight made of respect. The judge turned back to Thomas. "You've shown us what it means to serve not just with discipline, but with heart. For that, I thank you on behalf of everyone in this room." Thomas bowed his head slightly. "It has been my honor, sir." The judge smiled faintly. "And I believe that word, honor, is what this court has truly learned from you." He took a deep breath and looked around the room. "Before we conclude this witness session, I would like to invite everyone to stand, not as a formality, but as a gesture of respect." At first, there was silence. Then, one by one, people began to rise. The lawyers, the clerk, the guards, and even the visitors in the back stood quietly. It was not ordered. It was natural, sincere. Thomas stood still, his tall figure steady under the soft light. The bearskin hat cast a shadow over his face, but the calm in his posture said everything. The judge rose last, placing his hand over his chest. "Mr. Reed, on behalf of this court and this nation, we stand for you and all those who serve with the same spirit." The room filled with the sound of applause, not loud or wild, but deep and respectful. It wasn't just clapping for a man. It was clapping for everything he represented: duty, courage, and quiet strength. Thomas didn't smile or wave. He simply nodded once and stood silently, letting the moment pass over him. When the applause faded, he saluted the judge briefly, then turned to leave. As he walked out, a young boy sitting near the back whispered to his mother, "I want to be like him one day." The mother smiled softly and said, "Then remember to stand tall, just like he did." Outside, the rain had stopped. The clouds began to break and a soft ray of sunlight touched the courthouse steps. Thomas stepped out, the light falling over his red coat and shining boots. For a brief second, he looked up at the sky and thought of his brother. He didn't speak, but in his heart he whispered, "I kept the promise." Back inside, Judge Peterson stood by the window watching the guard walk away. He turned to his clerk and said quietly, "In all my years of law, I've never seen such grace. He came here as a witness, but he leaves as a teacher." The clerk nodded. "Yes, sir. The whole country will remember this." The judge smiled faintly. "As they should, because what he showed us wasn't just loyalty, it was the soul of service." Outside, Thomas disappeared into the street, just another man in uniform walking through the heart of London. Yet everyone who saw him that day knew they had witnessed something rare, a moment when silence spoke louder than words, and honor stood taller than pride. Would you like me to now expand Part 5 in the same 1,300-word simple and emotional storytelling style next? The next morning, London woke up to a story that had already traveled across the world. Newspapers, television channels, and social media were filled with headlines about the royal guard who stood before a judge and made the entire courtroom rise to their feet. People called him the silent hero, the man who guarded honor, and the soldier who spoke without anger. Yet while the world was talking about him, Thomas Reed was quietly putting on his uniform again, just like every other morning. He didn't read the news or watch television. He didn't even know how famous he had become overnight. For him, nothing had changed. His duty was the same as it had always been: to serve with respect and to stand with dignity. That morning, when he stepped out of his small apartment, he noticed a few neighbors smiling at him. One elderly woman waved from across the street and said softly, "Bless you, son. You reminded this country what respect means." Thomas only nodded politely and continued walking. He didn't feel like a hero. He was just doing what his heart told him was right. When he reached the palace gates, his fellow guards greeted him with proud smiles. One of them, a younger guard named Miller, whispered, "You've made us all proud, Thomas. The entire regiment watched your court video last night. Even the commander said you represented us with honor." Thomas looked at him with calm eyes. "We all represent the same thing, Miller," he said softly. "It was never about me. It was about what we stand for." As the morning routine began, tourists gathered around the palace gates, taking pictures of the guards in their red uniforms. For the first time, Thomas noticed something different in the way they looked at him. They weren't laughing or mocking like some had done before. They were standing quietly, almost in awe. A little boy near the front whispered to his father, "That's him, Dad. That's the guard from the video." The father nodded and said, "Then remember, son, that's what respect looks like." Thomas didn't move or react. He stood perfectly still, eyes forward, shoulders square, every part of his being focused on his duty. Yet deep inside, he felt something warm, a quiet pride that came not from attention but from understanding. People were finally seeing what the uniform meant. Later that afternoon, as he stood guard, a black car approached the palace gates. Out stepped a man in a formal suit. It was Judge Peterson. He had come without announcement, holding a small envelope in his hand. He stopped a few feet away from Thomas, who remained motionless as he was on duty. The judge smiled and said quietly to the officer nearby, "Please tell Mr. Reed I'm not here for official business. I just wanted to see him again." When the guard on rotation changed, Thomas was finally allowed to step aside. He walked toward the judge and saluted him respectfully. "Your Honor," he said, "this is unexpected." The judge smiled warmly. "I know, Mr. Reed. I just wanted to thank you once more in person. After our last session, something changed in me. For years, I thought law and order were the highest forms of duty, but you showed me that honor and humanity are just as important." Thomas stood quietly listening. The judge handed him the envelope. "This is a letter from the High Court," the judge said. "They wanted to commend you officially for your conduct. It's not common for the court to do this, but your actions inspired more people than you can imagine." Thomas took the envelope, but didn't open it. "Thank you, sir," he said humbly. "But I only did what I was trained to do." The judge chuckled softly. "Yes, but you did it with heart, and that's what people will remember." He extended his hand, and for the first time, the soldier and the judge shook hands, not as officer and witness, but as two men who understood each other deeply. As the judge turned to leave, he said quietly, "Take care of yourself. Mr. Reed, you've reminded the world what quiet strength looks like." That evening, when Thomas returned home, he finally opened the envelope. Inside was a letter from the High Court of London, written in neat cursive script. It read, "To Mr. Thomas Reed, Royal Guard of Buckingham Palace, in recognition of your unwavering discipline, respect, and honorable service, this court extends its gratitude. Your conduct within the courtroom has served as a reminder of the values this nation holds dear: duty, respect, and courage. May your example continue to inspire others." At the bottom was the signature of the Chief Justice and a small gold seal of the court. Thomas read it slowly, his expression still calm, but his heart was full. He placed the letter neatly inside a drawer next to an old framed photo of his brother in uniform. He looked at the picture for a long moment and whispered, "I did it, Daniel. I kept the promise." That night he couldn't sleep. The sounds of the city outside felt softer than usual. He sat by the window thinking about everything that had happened. The courtroom, the judge, the applause. But what stayed in his mind the most were his brother's words. Stand tall no matter what. He realized that standing tall wasn't only about posture. It was about standing for what you believe in, even when it's not easy. The next morning, the commander called all the guards together. He looked at Thomas and said, "The palace has received many messages of respect for you, Guard Reed. The Queen's office has been informed of your service and how you represented the regiment. They wish to express their gratitude." Thomas's eyes widened slightly, but he remained silent. The commander smiled and continued, "You are to be honored with a special commendation at the next ceremonial event. Your actions reminded the nation that the uniform is not just cloth. It's a symbol of loyalty and love." That day when Thomas stood at his post, he felt lighter. Not because of fame or awards, but because he knew he had lived up to the oath he took. Every hour he stood there, every moment he stayed silent. It all meant something deeper now. A few weeks later, during the changing of the guard ceremony, something remarkable happened. As Thomas stood in line with his fellow guards, hundreds of onlookers gathered. When the ceremony ended and the guards turned to march away, a wave of applause began from the crowd. At first it was soft, then it grew louder and louder. Tourists, locals, even visiting dignitaries clapped as the guards marched. Thomas didn't look up or break formation, but he could hear it. The sound of respect, not for him alone, but for what he represented. In the front row, Judge Peterson stood quietly, watching with pride. When the guards passed, he placed his hand over his heart and nodded respectfully. That night, when Thomas returned home, he took off his hat carefully and placed it on the table. He ran his fingers lightly over the fur, remembering his brother once again. He whispered softly, "We did it, Daniel. They understand now." He then looked out of the window at the city lights of London. The same streets, the same sounds, but everything felt different. He knew that life would go back to normal. Early mornings, long hours, and silent stands. But inside, he carried a quiet peace. He didn't need fame or recognition. The applause in the courtroom, the letter from the High Court, and the people's respect were all signs that his small act of honor had reached hearts everywhere. As he turned off the light and prepared for another day of duty, he looked at his uniform one last time and smiled faintly. It stood ready, perfectly pressed, waiting for him as always. For Thomas Reed, the Royal Guard, life wasn't about being noticed. It was about standing tall when it mattered most. And though he never said it aloud, everyone who had seen him knew one simple truth, that sometimes one quiet man's dignity can teach an entire world how to stand with pride. Would you like me to create a powerful, short title summary or closing quote for the full 5-part story, like an emotional end note for your audience or video?